In 1950, a steelworker in Pittsburgh had a heart attack on the job. He was 47 years old. He had worked in the mills for 22 years. He had a wife, 3 children, and a mortgage on a small house in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of the city. He had Social Security, which would pay him a retirement benefit when he turned 65. He had nothing else. The heart attack left him unable to do physical labor. The doctors told him he could not return to the mill. He was 47 years old, too young for Social Security retirement benefits by 18 years, and too disabled to do the work that had supported his family for 2 decades. His options were limited, and none of them were good. He could try to find lighter work, sitting jobs that his heart could manage, in a labor market that was not designed to accommodate a man with his specific limitations and that was not obligated to accommodate him at all. He could rely on his wife's income if she worked, on his children's contributions if they were old enough to contribute, and on whatever neighbors and family could provide out of generosity. He could apply to the county welfare office and attempt to qualify for general assistance, a means-tested welfare payment designed for the destitute that carried significant stigma and that required him to demonstrate essentially total poverty before receiving any support. Or he could manage on savings, which at the rate his family consumed them would last perhaps 2 years. There was no federal disability insurance. There was no program that recognized the specific situation of a working-age person who had paid into the Social Security system for decades and who had become unable to work through illness or injury before reaching retirement age. The gap between the working life and the retirement benefit was a gap that the federal government had simply not addressed. The Social Security Disability Insurance Program, which is what covers that steelworker's situation today, was established in 1956, 6 years after our Pittsburgh steelworker had his heart attack. It was the first federal program to provide income support specifically to workers who had become disabled before reaching retirement age. Before 1956, a person who became disabled during their working years had no federal safety net. After 1956, they had one, though accessing it was never easy, and the adequacy of the benefit has always been contested. This is the story of what happened to people who could not work before disability insurance existed, of the political battles that produced the 1956 program, of the system that has been built in the 70 years since, and of the ongoing debates about who deserves disability benefits, on what terms, and at what cost. To understand what disability meant before federal disability insurance existed, you need to understand the intersection of disability and poverty that has characterized the lives of people with disabilities throughout American history. The connection between disability and poverty is not coincidental or incidental. In an economy organized around wage labor, where income is primarily earned through the sale of labor power and where the ability to sell labor power depends on physical and mental capacity to work, any condition that impairs that capacity threatens income in direct and immediate ways. A worker who becomes ill or injured and cannot work stops earning. The family that depends on those earnings faces immediate financial crisis. This fundamental economic vulnerability of disability was understood throughout American history, but the response to it was primarily private and locally organized before the mid-20th century. Families were expected to care for their disabled members. Extended family networks were supposed to provide support when the immediate family's resources were insufficient. Private charity, churches, fraternal organizations, and mutual aid societies provided some assistance to disabled people who had no family support. And local and state government maintained institutions, poorhouses, and almshouses that housed the most destitute disabled people who had exhausted all other options. The institutional option, the poorhouse or the almshouse or the state asylum, was the response of last resort to disability in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And it was a response that was designed as much to confine and manage disabled people as to care for them. The poorhouses that housed elderly, disabled, and otherwise unable to work individuals were not therapeutic or rehabilitative institutions. They were custodial facilities that provided basic subsistence while removing the disabled person from the community where they had lived. The conditions in these institutions varied widely, but were frequently poor. Investigations of poorhouses in the late 19th and early 20th centuries found overcrowding, inadequate food and medical care, mixing of populations with very different needs, including the mentally ill, the physically disabled, the aged, and the temporarily unemployed, and a general atmosphere of neglect and sometimes abuse. The disability that had brought a person to the institution was often worsened by the conditions they encountered there. The workers' compensation system, which developed in most states between 1910 and 1920, addressed a specific subset of the disability problem, injuries and illnesses that occurred in the workplace. Workers' compensation provided a legal mechanism through which workers injured on the job could receive medical care and partial income replacement without having to sue their employers and prove negligence in court. In exchange, workers gave up the right to sue their employers for negligence. accepting the workers' compensation system as the exclusive remedy for workplace injuries. Workers' compensation was a genuine improvement over the pre-compensation system of employer liability litigation, which was expensive, slow, and produced inconsistent outcomes for injured workers. But it was limited in important ways. It covered only workplace injuries and illnesses, leaving workers who became disabled from non-work-related causes entirely outside its protection. It provided benefits that were typically less than full-wage replacement, and the definition of compensable injuries was contested by employers who had strong incentives to minimize their compensation liability. The Social Security Act of 1935, which established the old age insurance program that has become the foundation of retirement security for American workers, explicitly excluded disability from its coverage. The decision to exclude disability was a political calculation. Adding disability insurance to the program would have complicated the legislative negotiations and might have endangered the entire bill's passage. The architects of Social Security intended to add disability coverage in subsequent legislation once the old age insurance program was established and operating, but the subsequent legislation took 21 years to arrive. During those 21 years, the gap between the old age insurance program and disability coverage was filled by nothing at the federal level and by inadequate state programs at the state level. The states that had disability assistance programs maintained them as welfare programs, means-tested and stigmatized, providing minimal benefits to people who could demonstrate total destitution in addition to disability. The majority of disabled working-age people who needed income support either had no access to any program or had access only to the county welfare office, which required them to spend down whatever assets they had before qualifying for assistance. The development of the disability insurance program was shaped by intense political conflict between those who supported it and those who opposed it. The opposition came from several directions. Insurance industry groups that sold private disability insurance opposed a public program that would compete with their products. Business organizations opposed the payroll tax that would fund the program and the potential for workers to claim benefits fraudulently. Medical organizations worried about the role that medical evaluation would play in disability determinations and about the government's involvement in what they saw as a medical judgment. The supporters of disability insurance included labor unions that had been advocating for it since the 1940s, disability rights advocates, and the social insurance reformers who had designed the original Social Security program and who had always intended to add disability coverage. The political coalitions that these groups were able to build were sufficient to produce the 1956 legislation after years of failed attempts. The Social Security Disability Insurance Program that was established in 1956 was more limited than what its advocates had sought. It was restricted to workers age 50 and older, excluding younger workers with disabilities from its coverage. The eligibility criteria were strict, requiring a medical determination that the applicant was unable to engage in any substantial gainful activity, not just unable to do their specific prior job. And the administrative process for determining eligibility was controlled by state agencies under federal guidelines, producing variation in approval rates across states. The age restriction was removed in 1960, extending coverage to disabled workers of all ages who met the work and medical eligibility requirements. The program grew steadily through the 1960s and 1970s as eligibility criteria were clarified, as awareness of the program increased, and as the application process became better understood by potential applicants and their advocates. The addition of Medicare coverage for Social Security disability insurance recipients in 1972, providing health insurance after a 2-year waiting period following the onset of disability benefits, significantly increased the value of disability insurance by addressing the health insurance gap that left many disabled workers without coverage for the medical care that their conditions required. The Supplemental Security Income Program, also established in 1972, extended federal disability assistance to disabled people who did not have sufficient work history to qualify for Social Security disability insurance. SSI provided a federal means-tested benefit to aged, blind, and disabled individuals whose income and assets were below specified thresholds, replacing the patchwork of state general assistance programs that had previously been the only option for disabled people without adequate work histories. SSI was particularly important for people who had been disabled since childhood or early adulthood, before they had accumulated the work history that Social Security disability insurance required. A person who had been born with a disability, or who had become disabled as a teenager, had no Social Security work record and therefore could not qualify for SSDI regardless of the severity of their disability. SSI provided a federal safety net for these individuals that did not previously exist at the federal level. The growth of the disability insurance rolls through the 1970s and into the 1980s produced political concern about program integrity and costs. The Reagan administration conducted a sweeping review of the disability rolls in the early 1980s, removing hundreds of thousands of people from the program who the administration believed did not meet the eligibility criteria. The reviews were conducted without adequate consideration of the medical documentation that had supported original determinations, and many of the determinations were overturned on appeal. The process generated significant public backlash and congressional intervention that eventually stopped the reviews and required more careful procedures for continuing disability reviews. The episode illustrated the ongoing political contestation over who deserves disability benefits and how rigorously eligibility should be enforced. The tension between ensuring that the program reaches people who genuinely cannot work and preventing people who could work from receiving benefits has characterized disability policy throughout its history, and it reflects genuine complexity in the medical and functional assessment of disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which is discussed in the context of disability policy but is distinct from the disability insurance system, established the civil rights framework for disability, prohibiting discrimination against people with disabilities in employment, public accommodations, and government services. The ADA was based on a different conception of disability than the Social Security disability programs. Where SSDI and SSI defined disability in terms of inability to work, the ADA defined disability as a characteristic of a person that should not be the basis for discrimination, and it imposed obligations on employers and institutions to provide reasonable accommodations that would allow people with disabilities to participate fully. The tension between the Social Security disability program's work incapacity framework and the ADA's participation and accommodation framework has been a source of ongoing complexity in disability policy. A person who receives SSDI benefits based on a determination that they cannot engage in substantial gainful activity may also want to work, if appropriate accommodations and supports are provided. The two frameworks reflect different models of disability: the medical model, which focuses on the impairment and its functional consequences, and the social model, which focuses on the barriers that society creates for people with impairments. The Ticket to Work program, established in 1999, attempted to bridge this tension by providing financial incentives and support for SSDI recipients who wanted to attempt employment without immediately losing their benefits. The program has had limited success, partly because the rules governing the interaction between work and benefits are complex and sometimes counterproductive, and partly because the 2-year Medicare waiting period creates a strong disincentive to attempting employment that might fail, since a failed employment attempt could leave a person without health insurance while they wait for their benefits to be reinstated. The current disability insurance system, consisting of SSDI for workers with sufficient work history and SSI for those without, serves approximately 16 million Americans with approximately $200 billion in annual benefits. The system is administered by the Social Security Administration, with initial determinations made by state disability determination services under federal guidelines. The application process is notoriously slow and difficult. The average time from initial application to final determination, including the appeals process that most denied applicants must navigate, is measured in years. The initial approval rate for SSDI applications is approximately 20 to 25%, with most applicants requiring multiple levels of appeal before receiving a determination. The result is that applicants who are ultimately approved for benefits have typically waited 2 to 3 years before receiving their first payment, a period during which many have depleted their savings, lost their housing, and experienced significant deterioration in their health and well-being. The denial rate and the length of the appeals process are products of the strict eligibility criteria, the medical documentation requirements, and the administrative capacity constraints of the Social Security Administration, which processes millions of applications each year with limited staff. The backlog of pending appeals has been a persistent problem, and the people who are waiting for decisions are, by definition, people who cannot work and who have no income while they wait. The adequacy of disability benefits has also been a persistent concern. The average SSDI benefit in 2025 is approximately $1,500 per month, which is below the federal poverty level for a single person living alone in most parts of the country. The SSI benefit is even lower, at approximately $940 per month for an individual, well below the federal poverty level. People who live on these benefits face ongoing financial hardship, and the inability to significantly supplement benefits through work, without risking loss of benefits and health insurance, means that many disability recipients are effectively trapped in poverty. The Pittsburgh steelworker who had his heart attack in 1950 would have had access to SSDI if his heart attack had occurred in 1957 instead. He would have applied to the Social Security Administration, had a medical evaluation, waited months or possibly years for a determination, and if approved, received a monthly benefit that would not have replaced his full steelworker wages but would have provided a floor under the family's income. Whether he would have been approved is uncertain, because the eligibility criteria are strict and the approval process is difficult. Whether the benefit would have been adequate is also uncertain, because adequacy depends on the family's specific circumstances and the local cost of living. But he would have had something which is fundamentally different from the nothing that was available to him in 1950. The distance between nothing and something is the measure of what Social Security disability insurance has meant for the millions of Americans who have used it since 1956. The distance between what is available and what would be adequate is the measure of the work that remains, from the steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 who had nothing when his heart gave out, to the Social Security disability insurance program established in 1956, to the 16 million Americans receiving disability benefits today, to the applications that take years to process and the benefits that leave recipients in poverty. That is the history of disability insurance in America. The program exists. It is real. And it is still not adequate to the need it was designed to address. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. To understand the full human dimension of disability without federal insurance, you need to follow specific people through the experience of becoming disabled in the pre-1956 era and see what happened to them in the months and years that followed. The Pittsburgh steelworkers situation was representative of one category of disability, the working-age man who had accumulated decades of work history and who became disabled through a single acute medical event, a heart attack or a stroke or a serious injury. His situation was difficult, but it was not the most difficult, because he had a work history that might have provided some resources, family support, and the possibility of light work if he could find it. The more difficult situations were those of people who had been disabled since childhood or who became disabled in early adulthood before accumulating significant work history or savings. A young woman who contracted polio at age 20 and was left with significant physical limitations had no work history, no savings, no basis for claiming any insurance benefit, and no federal program designed to address her situation. Her options were her family, private charity, or the county welfare office. The polio epidemics that struck the United States repeatedly in the first half of the 20th century provide a particularly vivid case study of what disability meant before federal disability insurance existed. Poliomyelitis, which could cause permanent paralysis in its most severe forms, affected primarily children and young adults. The survivors who were left with significant physical limitations faced a lifetime of managing their disability in a society that had no systematic provision for them. Franklin Roosevelt's experience with polio is the most famous case, but it is also the most atypical. Roosevelt had exceptional family resources, the wealth and connections to obtain the best available care, the political ambition and personal resilience to find ways to manage his disability in the public eye, and eventually the power to shape the policy response to disability, and many other social problems. His experience of disability was shaped by privilege in ways that the experience of most polio survivors was not. The typical polio survivor of the 1930s or 1940s faced a situation that was determined primarily by their family's resources and by the availability of rehabilitation services in their community. The National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which Roosevelt helped found and which became famous for its March of Dimes fundraising, provided some support for rehabilitation services and research. But the foundation's resources were far smaller than the need, and the rehabilitation services that were available were concentrated in urban areas and in institutions that required long-term residency away from the patient's community and family. The stigma associated with disability in the pre-1956 era was severe and affected every aspect of disabled people's lives. Employers who could choose between hiring a disabled person and a non-disabled person had obvious incentives to choose the latter, particularly in an era when disability was often associated with reduced productivity and when no legal obligation to provide accommodations existed. The physical environments of workplaces, public buildings, and transportation were designed without consideration of accessibility, meaning that people with mobility limitations faced practical barriers to participation in many aspects of economic and social life. The institutional response to disability that characterized the pre-federal insurance era was not simply the poorhouse and the almshouse. It also included specialized institutions for specific types of disability, schools for the blind, schools for the deaf, hospitals for the tuberculosis disabled, facilities for the mentally ill, and institutions for people with intellectual disabilities. These institutions ranged from genuinely therapeutic and supportive to custodial and abusive, and the population of disabled people who were institutionalized at any given time in the early 20th century was large. The census of 1940 found approximately 23 million Americans reporting some form of functional limitation, a number that substantially understated the actual prevalence of disability because of the stigma associated with reporting it and the variability in how disability was defined. Of these, a significant fraction were outside the labor force and without any source of income other than family support or institutional care. The specific impact of disability on family finances was catastrophic and well documented by social workers who dealt with disabled people and their families in the pre-insurance era. A family that had been financially stable on one income lost stability immediately when the earner became disabled. The savings that the family had accumulated were typically consumed within months, even in families that had been relatively thrifty, because the combination of lost income and increased medical expenses depleted savings rapidly. The medical expenses associated with disability were themselves a significant problem in the pre-Medicare era. A disabled worker who needed ongoing medical care, physical therapy, or specialized equipment faced those costs without health insurance in most cases, since employer-provided health insurance was not yet widespread in the early 1950s, and individual health insurance for people with pre-existing conditions was either unavailable or unaffordably expensive. The combination of lost income and increased medical expenses produced a downward spiral for many families. Savings were exhausted, other assets were sold, family members who had not been working entered the labor market to supplement income, the family moved to smaller housing to reduce expenses, and eventually the disabled person and the family arrived at a state of genuine destitution that made them eligible for county welfare, which they had spent years trying to avoid. The county welfare application was itself a humiliating process in the pre-SSI era. It required the applicant to demonstrate poverty to the satisfaction of a welfare worker who had discretion over whether to approve the application and at what level. The documentation required was extensive, the attitude of welfare workers toward applicants was often condescending or hostile, and the benefit levels were set deliberately low to minimize welfare dependency. The means test required applicants to have essentially no assets before qualifying, which meant that any property or savings they had were supposed to be exhausted before public assistance began. The result was that the transition from middle-class working family to welfare recipient, which disability could produce within a period of months, involved not just financial loss but loss of status, autonomy, and dignity in ways that compounded the impact of the disability itself. The psychological consequences of this transition were significant and were documented by social workers who observed the phenomenon repeatedly in the families they served. Understanding this context is essential for understanding the significance of the 1956 Disability Insurance Program, because the program's most important feature was not primarily economic but social. By framing disability benefits as social insurance, as earned benefits to which workers were entitled based on their work history and their Social Security contributions rather than as charity provided to the destitute, the program fundamentally changed the relationship between the disabled worker and the government support they received. A worker who applied for Social Security disability insurance was applying for a benefit they had paid for through decades of payroll tax contributions. They were not asking for charity. They were claiming an insurance benefit to which they were entitled by virtue of their work history and their contributions to the system. This framing, which was deliberate and which had been central to the design of Social Security from its origins, transformed the experience of receiving disability support from a stigmatized welfare experience to an earned insurance claim. The framing was not just symbolic, it had practical consequences. The administrative process for SSDI, while imperfect and often slow, was governed by legal standards and procedural protections that welfare programs did not provide. Applicants had the right to appeal denials. The criteria for eligibility were legally specified rather than left to the discretion of individual welfare workers. And the benefit levels, while modest, were based on the applicant's work history rather than on a judgment about what level of poverty the applicant needed to be in before receiving help. These features of SSDI made it a qualitatively different kind of support from what had existed before, even if the dollar amounts were not dramatically different. The Pittsburgh steelworker who applied for SSDI in 1957 would have been interacting with a federal insurance system that recognized his claim as a right rather than a plea. The dignity implications of that difference were real, even if they were difficult to quantify. The Supplemental Security Income Program of 1972, which extended federal support to disabled people without sufficient work history, was designed to capture some of the same dignity benefits of the insurance framing even for a welfare program. By federalizing the program and establishing uniform national standards, SSI replaced the highly discretionary and variable state welfare programs with a more consistent national standard that, while still means-tested, was governed by legal criteria that could be appealed and enforced. The ongoing evolution of the disability insurance system since 1956 has been shaped by two persistent tensions: the tension between the program's cost and its coverage, and the tension between the work incapacity model that governs eligibility and the emerging understanding of disability that emphasizes participation and accommodation rather than incapacity and withdrawal. The cost coverage tension has produced periodic episodes of program restriction, most dramatically the Reagan-era reviews of the early 1980s, but also more gradual tightening of eligibility standards and administrative processes in subsequent decades. Each episode of restriction has generated debate about whether the program is serving people who genuinely cannot work or supporting people who could work if appropriate supports were available. The empirical answer to this question is that most SSDI recipients do have genuine medical conditions that significantly limit their ability to work, and that the approval process, while imperfect, generally succeeds in distinguishing between those who can and cannot work. The fraud rate in the disability programs, while not zero, is lower than the political rhetoric about disability fraud suggests, and the approved population is genuinely more disabled on average than the general population. The participation model tension has been harder to resolve within the current program structure because the work incapacity standard for SSDI eligibility is inherently in tension with the ADA's emphasis on employment with accommodation. A person who qualifies for SSDI because they cannot do substantial gainful activity has little legal ability to work without risking their benefits, even if they could work part-time or in accommodated positions. The Ticket to Work program and various other work incentive programs have attempted to create pathways for disability recipients to attempt employment without immediately losing benefits, but the programs are complex and underutilized. The 16 million Americans who receive disability benefits in 2025 are a diverse population that includes people with severe physical disabilities that clearly preclude any employment, people with moderate limitations that might allow some work under the right circumstances, people with mental health conditions that fluctuate in their severity and their functional impact, and people who are in the gray zone between full disability and full capacity, who find themselves caught between a program that requires near total incapacity for eligibility and a labor market that offers limited opportunities for people with significant limitations. Understanding this diversity is important for understanding both the achievements and the limitations of the disability insurance system. The system was designed around a specific model of disability, the acute event that produces permanent and total incapacity that applies clearly to some of its recipients and less clearly to others. As the nature of disability has changed, with increasing prevalence of chronic conditions, mental health conditions, and the cumulative effects of multiple moderate limitations, the fit between the program's design and the actual population it is trying to serve has become increasingly imperfect. The Pittsburgh steelworker with his heart attack fit the original model well: a single acute event, a clear medical determination of incapacity, a work history that established prior contribution to the system. The 50-year-old with chronic back pain, depression, and diabetes who applies for disability today fits the model much less cleanly, and the administrative process for determining their eligibility is correspondingly more contested and more variable in its outcomes. Building a disability support system that serves this more complex population effectively would require rethinking some of the fundamental assumptions of the 1956 design, moving toward a system that supports participation and accommodation alongside income support, rather than treating work incapacity and income support as the only relevant dimensions of disability policy. From the steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 who had nothing when his heart gave out, to the Social Security disability insurance of 1956 that created the first federal protection for workers who became disabled before retirement age, to the 16 million recipients of 2025, and the ongoing debates about coverage, adequacy, and the relationship between disability benefits and employment. That is the history. The progress is real. The remaining challenges are equally real. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. The international comparison provides important context for understanding where the American disability insurance system stands relative to what other wealthy countries have built. Most European countries provide disability benefits that are more generous and more accessible than the American system. Germany's disability insurance provides benefits at a higher replacement rate than SSDI and has a less adversarial determination process. The Netherlands, which reformed its disability insurance system extensively in the early 2000s after experiencing high rates of disability claims, developed a model that combines income support with active return-to-work support, providing financial incentives for both employers and disabled workers to find ways to maintain employment with accommodations rather than defaulting to full disability. Withdrawal from the labor market. The Nordic countries provide disability benefits as part of comprehensive social insurance systems that also include generous sick pay, rehabilitation services, and active labor market programs. The integration of disability support with broader social insurance means that a person who becomes disabled does not face the cliff between full employment and full disability that characterizes the American SSDI system. They can receive partial benefits while working reduced hours, can access rehabilitation services as part of their benefit package, and can transition between work and disability support more flexibly as their condition changes. The United Kingdom's disability benefit system has been extensively reformed and contracted since 2010, with work capability assessments that have been widely criticized for producing inaccurate determinations and for failing to account for the full range of functional limitations that affect disabled people's ability to work. The British reforms provide a cautionary example of what happens when disability benefit reform is driven primarily by cost reduction rather than by evidence about what actually works to support disabled people and promote employment. These international comparisons suggest that the American disability insurance system, while it has achieved significant progress since 1956, is not the only possible approach to providing income security to people who cannot work due to disability. The specific features of the American system, its work history requirement for SSDI, its strict incapacity standard, its lengthy administrative process, its modest benefit levels, and its limited integration with rehabilitation and return-to-work support, reflect political choices that were made in 1956 and that have been modified incrementally since, but have not been fundamentally reconsidered. A disability support system designed from scratch with the knowledge accumulated in the 70 years since 1956 might look quite different. More flexible in its relationship between work and benefits, more integrated with healthcare and rehabilitation, more responsive to the diverse conditions that prevent full-time employment without necessarily producing total incapacity, and better calibrated to the actual cost of living in different parts of the country. Whether the American disability system will evolve in these directions depends on the political conditions that determine when and how social insurance programs are reformed. The history of SSDI suggests that significant reforms typically require a combination of documented inadequacy, organized advocacy, and a political moment when reform is possible. The documented inadequacies of the current system, the years-long waits for determinations, the benefits that leave recipients in poverty, the cliff between work and benefits that discourages employment attempts are well established. The organized advocacy for disability policy reform is active and sophisticated. The political moment has not yet arrived, but understanding the history of how the current system was built, what problems it was designed to solve, and where it has and has not succeeded, is the foundation for building the political case for the reforms that are needed. The steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 needed something that did not exist. The Social Security Disability Insurance Program of 1956 created something for the steelworkers who came after him. The 16 million Americans receiving disability benefits today have that something. The question is whether that something will be improved to be adequate to the actual needs of the people who depend on it. From the steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 to the SSDI of 1956 to the 16 million recipients of 2025. The history is long, the progress is real, the remaining work is significant. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. There is a dimension of the disability story that connects the history of disability benefits to the broader story of who is counted and who is protected in the American economy. That dimension is the relationship between disability and work, and specifically the question of what it means to be unable to work in an economy that assigns human worth primarily through employment. The social insurance programs that define American economic security, Social Security, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, disability insurance, are all built around the assumption that the normal state of a working-age adult is employment and that the programs exist to address temporary or permanent deviations from that normal state. A person who loses their job receives unemployment insurance. A person who is injured at work receives workers' compensation. A person who becomes disabled receives disability insurance. A person who reaches retirement age receives Social Security. This employment-centered framework assigns the most generous and accessible benefits to the most common deviations from normal employment, job loss, and retirement. The less common and more complex deviations, disability in particular, receive less generous and less accessible benefits, partly because they are less common and partly because the definition and determination of disability is inherently more complex and contested than the definition and determination of job loss or retirement. The employment-centered framework also assigns less protection to people who are outside the normal employment relationship. Unpaid caregivers who provide care to children, elderly relatives or disabled family members, people who work in the informal economy, people with significant gaps in their employment history due to illness, caregiving, or other circumstances, and people who have never been able to maintain stable employment due to disabilities that began in childhood or early adulthood. These populations are disproportionately women, disproportionately people of color, and disproportionately the most economically vulnerable members of the population. The employment-centered framework systematically provides less protection to the people who are most vulnerable to economic hardship because their connection to the formal employment system is least secure. The disability insurance system has attempted to address this problem partially through the SSI program, which provides benefits without a work history requirement. But SSI's benefit levels are even lower than SSDI's, its means testing requirements are more onerous, and its stigma as a welfare program rather than an insurance benefit is greater. The people who receive SSI rather than SSDI are generally the most disabled, the most economically vulnerable, and the least well protected by the current system. A disability support system that was designed around the actual diversity of people who cannot work, rather than around the specific situation of the working-age male industrial worker, who was the assumed beneficiary of the original SSDI design, would need to be different in fundamental ways. It would need to provide adequate support to people who have never been able to maintain stable employment due to disabilities that began before they accumulated work history. It would need to provide support to unpaid caregivers whose labor, while not compensated in the market, is essential to the functioning of the economy and society. And it would need to provide support that is adequate to the actual cost of living with a disability, which is typically higher than the cost of living without one due to the additional medical, adaptive, and support costs that disability imposes. These reforms would be expensive. They would also produce real benefits for real people who are currently inadequately served by the existing system, and they would reflect a more honest accounting of what it means to be unable to work and of the full range of people who find themselves in that situation. The Pittsburgh steelworker who had his heart attack in 1950 deserved better than what the system offered him. The 1956 disability insurance program gave his successors something better. The 16 million Americans receiving disability benefits today are getting something better than the steelworker had, though still not enough. And the people who are not getting even that, the people who are too disabled to work but who do not meet the strict eligibility criteria for SSDI or who are waiting years for a determination while their financial situation deteriorates, deserve better than what the current system provides. Understanding the history of how we got here is the beginning of understanding what a better system would look like. From the steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950, to the SSDI of 1956, to the SSI of 1972, to the ADA of 1990, to the 16 million recipients and the millions more who are inadequately served by the current system. The history is one of real progress and real remaining inadequacy. The goal of ensuring that no American who cannot work is left without adequate support has not been achieved. It remains worth pursuing. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. The numbers that make this history concrete are worth stating clearly. In 1956, when SSDI was established, approximately 150,000 workers applied in the first year. The program was small, the eligibility criteria were strict, and awareness was limited. By 1970, approximately 1.5 million people were receiving SSDI benefits. The program had grown as awareness increased and as coverage extended to younger workers. By 1990, approximately 3 million people were receiving SSDI. The program had grown with the population and with the prevalence of chronic conditions that produce disability. By 2013, at the peak of post-recession disability claims, approximately 8.9 million workers and 2 million dependents were receiving SSDI, with another 8 million receiving SSI. The combined disability program caseload was approaching 19 million people, a number that generated significant political attention and concern about program growth. In 2025, approximately 8.4 million workers receive SSDI, and approximately 7.5 million people receive SSI, for a combined total of approximately 16 million disability benefit recipients. The average SSDI benefit is approximately $1,500 per month. The average SSI benefit is approximately $940 per month. Both amounts are below the federal poverty level. The application backlog for SSDI in 2025 includes approximately 1 million pending cases at various stages of the appeals process. The average wait time from initial application to final determination for those who appeal denials is approximately 2 years. During those 2 years, applicants who cannot work have no income from the program they are waiting to access. The federal poverty level for a single person in 2025 is approximately $15,000 per year, or approximately $1,250 per month. The average SSDI benefit of $2,500 per month is just above this threshold. The average SSI benefit of $940 per month is well below it. These numbers describe a system that provides real support to real people, that reaches 16 million Americans who would have nothing in the pre-1956 era, and that provides benefits that are insufficient for adequate living in most parts of the country. The steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 had nothing. His counterpart today has $1,500 a month and a 2-year wait. The distance between nothing and something is real and significant. The distance between something and enough is equally real and significant. From nothing in 1950 to SSDI in 1956 to 16 million recipients in 2025 to benefits that leave recipients below or near the poverty line. That is the history of disability benefits in America. The progress is real. The remaining work is equally real. And every American who cannot work deserves adequate support while they cannot. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. One more observation connects this history directly to the present moment in American disability policy. That observation is about the relationship between the opioid epidemic, the increase in disability claims, and the political debate that followed. In the period from roughly 2000 to 2013, disability insurance claims grew significantly, faster than population growth and faster than the growth in the rate of disability-producing conditions that would be expected from demographic and health trends alone. This growth attracted political attention and generated a debate about whether the disability programs were experiencing abuse, whether eligibility standards were being applied too loosely, and whether disability had become a form of long-term unemployment insurance for people who could not find work. The research on this question produced findings that were more nuanced than the political debate suggested. Some of the growth in disability claims did reflect the effects of the recession, as workers who had lost jobs and faced poor employment prospects turned to disability insurance in the absence of other income support. This is not fraud. These were people with genuine medical conditions who might have continued working in better economic conditions, but who, in the post-recession labor market, could not find employment that accommodated their limitations. Some of the growth reflected the aging of the baby boom generation into the peak disability years of their 50s and early 60s, when chronic conditions that had been managed while working became more limiting. This is the expected demographic effect of an aging workforce and is not evidence of program abuse. Some of the growth in specific regions, particularly in Appalachia and parts of the rural Midwest, reflected the devastation of the opioid epidemic, which produced both physical disability from chronic pain and addiction-related conditions and mental health conditions that genuinely prevented employment. The communities where opioid addiction was most severe were also the communities where disability claims grew most rapidly, suggesting a direct causal relationship between the epidemic and the disability claims. Understanding the relationship between the opioid epidemic and disability claims is important because it illustrates the way in which disability insurance functions as part of the broader social safety net, absorbing the consequences of failures in other parts of the system. Communities that lacked adequate mental health treatment, that lacked addiction treatment, that lacked employment opportunities, that had been devastated by the loss of manufacturing jobs. These communities saw increased disability claims because disability insurance was the only federal program available to people whose circumstances prevented employment. This is not a failure of the disability insurance system. It is the disability insurance system working as designed, providing income to people who cannot work due to medical conditions. The policy failure is in the other dimensions of social support that were inadequate. The healthcare that did not prevent or treat the conditions, the economic development that did not provide alternative employment, the addiction treatment that was not available to the people who needed it, the political debate about disability program growth that peaked around 2013 and 2014 produced some administrative tightening of eligibility standards, but no fundamental reform of the program. What actually reduced the disability rolls after 2013 was primarily the economic recovery, which allowed some people who had turned to disability insurance during the recession to return to employment as labor market conditions improved. The lesson is the same one that the history of disability policy has consistently taught. The disability insurance system is one part of a broader social support infrastructure, and its adequacy depends on the adequacy of that broader infrastructure. When other parts of the system fail, the disability program absorbs the consequences. Addressing the inadequacies of the disability program requires not just reforming the program itself, but strengthening the broader infrastructure within which it operates. Healthcare, addiction treatment, mental health services, vocational rehabilitation, and employment support that help people with disabilities maintain employment where possible and transition smoothly to disability benefits when employment is not possible. This is a larger agenda than disability policy alone. It is the agenda that the history of disability in America consistently points toward. From the steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 to the SSDI of 1956 to the opioid epidemic and the disability claims of the 2010s to the 16 million recipients of 2025. The history connects the individual to the structural in ways that demand both individual support and structural response. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead. The last word on this history belongs to the steelworker, because his situation in 1950 is the clearest measure of what the absence of federal disability insurance actually meant for a specific person in specific circumstances. He was 47 years old. He had worked for 22 years. He had paid taxes and supported his family and done everything the American economy asked of him. And when his heart gave out, there was nothing for him except the charity of family, neighbors, and the county welfare office. That outcome was not a personal failure. It was a policy failure. The United States had a social security system. It had workers' compensation. It had unemployment insurance. It had the framework for social insurance. It simply had not extended that framework to cover the specific situation of a working-age person who became permanently unable to work. The 1956 Disability Insurance Program corrected that specific failure. It extended the social insurance framework to cover disability before retirement age. It gave workers like the Pittsburgh steelworker a program they could turn to when their health made continued employment impossible. The program it created is imperfect. The benefits are too low. The waiting times are too long. The benefit levels leave recipients in poverty. The work disincentives discourage employment attempts that might succeed. The coverage gaps leave some disabled people without access to any federal disability support. These are real failures that deserve real solutions. But they are failures of a program that exists, that provides real support to 16 million Americans, that is fundamentally different from the nothing that existed before 1956. The steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 had nothing. The steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1957 had something. That something has grown and improved and still fallen short over the 70 years since. The history of disability insurance in America is the history of that gap between the nothing that existed before 1956 and the something that has existed since, and between the something that exists now and the adequacy that the people who depend on it deserve. From the steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950, to the SSDI of 1956, to the 16 million recipients of 2025, to the benefits that are real and insufficient simultaneously. That is the history. And the remaining work is closing the gap between real and sufficient. Subscribe if you want to keep following this kind of history. There is more ahead. The final observation about this history is also the simplest, and it connects the abstract policy history to the concrete human reality that the policy exists to address. Every day in the United States, approximately 10,000 workers apply for Social Security disability insurance. They are people who have worked, who have paid into the system, and who have reached a point where continuing to work is no longer possible. They are people with heart disease, with cancer, with musculoskeletal conditions, with mental illness, with the full range of conditions that can prevent sustained employment. Most of them will be denied on their initial application. Most of them will appeal. Most of them will wait years before receiving a final determination. During that waiting period, they will have no income from the program they are trying to access, and they will be spending down whatever savings they have, relying on whatever family support is available, and managing however they can. The ones who are eventually approved will receive a monthly benefit that is above the poverty line in most states, but that is insufficient for comfortable living in any state. They will receive Medicare after a 2-year waiting period. They will live with the ongoing uncertainty of continuing disability reviews that could result in their benefits being terminated if their condition improves, or if the review process determines that their condition is no longer sufficient for continued eligibility. These are not hypothetical people. They are the 10,000 workers who applied today, and the 10,000 who will apply tomorrow, and the 10,000 who will apply the day after that. They are the 16 million who are already in the system, and the millions more who are waiting for determinations. The Pittsburgh steelworker in 1950 had nothing. His successors today have something real, something imperfect, something inadequate, and something better than nothing. The history ends there. The work continues. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is more ahead. There is one more dimension of this history that deserves to be part of the record before we close. It is the dimension of the people who provided care for disabled family members before federal disability insurance existed and what their experience was. The pre-1956 disability landscape was not simply the story of disabled workers and their financial hardship. It was also the story of the families who organized themselves around caring for disabled members, and specifically of the women whose paid and unpaid labor absorbed the consequences of disability that the social insurance system did not address. When the Pittsburgh steelworker had his heart attack in 1950, his wife's life changed in ways that were as consequential as the changes in his. She may have entered the paid labor force for the first time, or increased her hours if she was already working, to replace some fraction of the income her husband could no longer earn. She became the primary caregiver for her husband, managing his medical appointments, his medications, his dietary restrictions, and the emotional weight of living with someone whose health was precarious. She managed the family's finances as they declined, making the decisions about what to give up first, what to sell, when to ask for help. The labor that women provided in managing disability within the family was essential and uncounted. It did not appear in economic statistics. It did not generate Social Security contributions. It was invisible in the way that all caregiving labor was invisible in the American economy of the 1950s. And it was labor that was provided without any corresponding social support, because the social insurance system that was supposed to provide support for disability was focused on the disabled worker rather than on the family system within which the disability was being managed. The 1956 Disability Insurance Program provided income to the disabled worker. It provided nothing directly to the spouse or other family members who were providing care. The caregiving burden that the family absorbed, and that primarily fell on women, was not counted, compensated, or supported by the program. This invisibility of caregiving labor in the disability policy framework has persisted to the present day. The Social Security system does not count caregiving years toward Social Security eligibility, meaning that women who take time out of the paid workforce to care for disabled family members accumulate gaps in their Social Security record that reduce their own retirement benefits. The disability insurance system focuses on the disabled individual rather than on the care system that supports them, leaving family caregivers without direct support or recognition. This is a significant gap in a disability policy framework that is otherwise more developed than what existed before 1956. Addressing it would require either building caregiver support into the disability insurance system directly or creating separate support for caregivers that recognizes their labor and provides them with some measure of the economic security that their caregiving work prevents them from building through paid employment. The history of disability policy in America has consistently overlooked the caregiving dimension of disability, focusing on the disabled person's income and medical needs while treating the care that disabled people receive as a private family matter rather than a social and economic one. A more complete disability policy would address both dimensions. From the steelworker in Pittsburgh in 1950 to his wife who absorbed the consequences of his disability, to the SSDI that provided income to disabled workers but not to their caregivers, to the 16 million disability recipients of 2025 and the millions of family caregivers who support them. The history of disability in America is incomplete without the history of caregiving, and a disability policy that is adequate to the actual experience of disability in American families would need to address both. Subscribe if this kind of history is what you are here for. There is a great deal more of it ahead.